What if some of the things we are most certain about are not wrong, but unfinished? History, as we inherit it, often arrives neatly packaged. Dates line up. Progress moves forward. Knowledge accumulates. Each generation, we are told, knows more than the last. It is a comforting story, orderly and reassuring, suggesting that human understanding grows steadily, like a rising tide that never retreats. But every so often, something disrupts that calm surface. It begins quietly. A body uncovered in frozen ground, a fish hauled from deep water, footprints pressed into ancient ash. These moments do not announce themselves as revolutions. At first, they appear as curiosities, footnotes, anomalies easily set aside. Yet over time, they begin to press against the edges of what we think we know. This story is about those moments, not scandals, not conspiracies, but discoveries that forced experts to pause, reconsider, and sometimes admit that long-held teachings were incomplete. It is about the fragile space between certainty and evidence, and about how human knowledge often advances not in straight lines, but through uncomfortable revisions. For centuries, education has relied on clarity. We teach students when civilizations began, what ancient people were capable of, how long humans can survive in extreme conditions, when technology emerged, when species vanished forever. These lessons are presented as facts, not guesses. They are reinforced through repetition, exams, and authority. Yet the past does not always cooperate. In remote places and forgotten layers of Earth, evidence waits patiently. It does not care what is written in textbooks. It simply exists, unchanged, until someone stumbles upon it. And when that happens, the discovery does not argue. It does not persuade. It merely shows itself. A skeleton with organs intact after more than a century in ice challenges assumptions about human endurance. A living species thought extinct for millions of years questions our confidence in the fossil record. Precision tools and medical techniques from deep antiquity blur the line between primitive and advanced. Structures older than agriculture hint that human organization may have followed a different path than the one we teach. These are not stories of ancient superiority or modern failure. They are reminders of something more subtle and more human. We are storytellers by nature. To make sense of the past, we simplify. We draw timelines, we define eras, we label beginnings and endings. In doing so, we sometimes mistake the map for the terrain. This documentary journey is not about replacing one rigid narrative with another. It is about holding space for uncertainty, about recognizing that knowledge is provisional, shaped by what we have found so far and limited by what remains hidden. Across the next chapters, we will move through ice fields, oceans, deserts, and ruins. We will encounter sailors, surgeons, map makers, builders, and anonymous figures whose lives left traces strong enough to reach us across time. Each chapter begins with a single discovery, but none of them end there. Instead, each raises a quiet question. What does it mean when humans survive longer than science predicted? What does extinction really mean, if life can persist unseen for millions of years? What if technological knowledge can be lost as easily as it is gained? And what if progress is not a straight ascent, but a pattern of remembering and forgetting? These stories are not meant to dismantle trust in science or scholarship. On the contrary, they reveal its most honest strength, the ability to change when evidence demands it. The willingness to revise, to admit uncertainty, to grow. In the end, this is a story about humility, about understanding that the past is larger, stranger, and more complex than any single narrative can contain, and about accepting that what we know today is not a final answer, but a moment in an ongoing conversation between evidence, interpretation, and human curiosity. The question we carry forward is simple, but profound. How much of history is settled, and how much is still waiting to be understood? It began with a frozen face staring back through time. In 1984, a research team ventured into the Arctic silence, a wind-scraped island lost in a white sea. They were seeking geological data, not ghosts. But what they found shattered long-held beliefs about human survival in extreme environments. Half buried in permafrost lay the body of a sailor, perfectly preserved. His clothes intact, his eyes half-lidded, his skin still clinging to bone. They identified him as a member of the Franklin expedition, the ill-fated 1845 journey of 2 British ships and 129 men, all presumed lost while searching for the Northwest Passage. For more than a century, history told a clear story. They had died quickly, starved, frozen, perhaps within months of abandoning their ice-locked ships. Textbooks pointed to the expedition as a cautionary tale, a tragic testament to how swiftly nature claims the unprepared. But this man refused to fit the narrative. Tests on his remains showed something astonishing. His organs were intact. His tissues suggested not weeks, but years of survival after the ships were deserted. The contents of his stomach revealed he had been eating, sustaining himself in the unrelenting Arctic cold. Nearby artifacts hinted at attempts to adapt, to endure. Human teeth marks on bones suggested something darker. Cannibalism, perhaps, born not of savagery, but desperation. The discovery sent shockwaves through Arctic survival research. Established experts balked. The data couldn't be right. The body's condition defied known limits. For decades, the Franklin expedition had been cited as definitive proof of human vulnerability in polar conditions, and now that proof was in question. But as more bodies were uncovered over the years, sealed in ice, faces still caught mid-expression, the pattern repeated. Survivors had endured not for weeks or months, but for years. Their remains bore witness to a harsh, protracted fight against starvation, poisoning, and despair. What killed them wasn't just the cold. It was the very supplies meant to keep them alive. Canned food tainted with lead, malnutrition, diseases like scurvy, and perhaps worst of all, abandonment, not only by their command, but by the knowledge that should have helped them survive. This story does more than rewrite survival textbooks. It touches something deeper. It challenges the line we draw between what we believe is possible and what the human will can withstand. In classrooms, we teach limits. 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. These are useful averages, but in the ice, they were rewritten by grit, by the refusal to surrender, even as supplies dwindled and frost crept into bone. And it reminds us that sometimes science lags behind reality. Experts taught what they believed was true, that such survival was impossible. But belief isn't fact. And when belief resists evidence, we risk mistaking certainty for truth. The frozen sailor tells a quiet story, one of endurance, of slow, cold suffering, but also of resilience that outlasted every assumption. So we ask, what else have we declared impossible, simply because we had not yet seen it survive? It was a fish that shouldn't have existed. In 1938, off the coast of South Africa, a local trawler brought up something strange from the deep. Among the nets of ordinary catch lay a fish with fins like limbs, thick, lobed, and unmistakably ancient. When a museum curator examined it, she knew it was unusual. But when sketches reached a fish expert, his response was disbelief, then astonishment. It was a coelacanth, a species that every biology textbook confidently claimed had gone extinct 66 million years ago, alongside the dinosaurs. Students had studied its fossilized remains as a transitional link in evolution, a key chapter in the story of how life moved from sea to land. Paleontology courses taught the coelacanth as a dead end, a creature frozen in stone, its place in history complete. Its extinction was not debated. It was fact, until it wasn't. The discovery of a living coelacanth forced science to confront a difficult truth. The fossil record, long treated as a definitive ledger of life, is fragmentary at best. For a species to disappear from that record for 66 million years and then reappear alive was more than improbable. It was paradigm-breaking, and it didn't stop there. When scientists studied the fish, they found it had changed little, if at all, from its fossil ancestors. It was a relic, a living fossil. Evolutionary theory expected gradual adaptation, pressure to change. But here was a creature that had withstood time by remaining still. While continents shifted, climates changed, and species came and went, the coelacanth endured, unchanged in its hidden realm. The term Lazarus taxon was born, species thought extinct that re-emerge unexpectedly. Since then, other living fossils have been found, but none as symbolically powerful as the coelacanth. Its survival didn't just add a new chapter to textbooks, it erased and rewrote earlier ones. Because if this species could escape detection for millions of years, what else might lie hidden? This wasn't a failure of evidence, it was a lesson in humility. We assumed extinction where we saw absence. We confused silence with certainty. In doing so, we crafted a timeline that was clean, logical, and linear. A timeline that didn't leave room for mystery. The coelacanth reminded us that the world is vast and our reach limited, that the ocean especially holds truths beyond the light of our knowing. For decades, students had memorized facts about extinction with confidence, but a single fish, gasping on the deck of a trawler, showed that some of those facts were assumptions dressed in authority. This discovery didn't negate science, it made it honest. Science is not about certainty. It is about asking, revising, and accepting that what we know is only what we've discovered so far. So the question the coelacanth asks is not just scientific, it is philosophical. How much of what we call extinct is merely unseen? And in our hunger for answers, how often do we mistake absence for truth? They were just footprints, until they weren't. In 1976, in the volcanic ash fields of Laetoli, Tanzania, paleontologists uncovered a trail. At first, it seemed unremarkable, a series of impressions hardened in time, preserved by ashfall from an ancient eruption. But as researchers brushed away the dust, the shapes became unmistakable. Human-like footprints. The ash was dated to 3.6 million years ago. According to every anthropology textbook, no human ancestor at that time should have been capable of walking with a modern gait. Yet these prints told another story, one step at a time. Heel strike, arch, toe push-off. The stride was fluid, balanced. Not the awkward shuffling of a transitional creature, but the confident rhythm of someone walking upright, just like us. It contradicted everything. Anthropologists had long taught a gradual, clear timeline of human evolution. Around 3.6 million years ago, our ancestors were supposed to still be semi-arboreal, tree-dwelling beings with curved feet built for grasping branches. The prevailing model was simple. Apes climbed, early hominins wobbled, modern humans walked. But these tracks weren't transitional. They were anatomical statements in volcanic ash. The individuals who left them walked fully upright, with feet structurally indistinguishable from ours. The evolutionary timeline didn't account for this. The textbooks didn't have a place for it. And so began the resistance. Maybe the prints weren't as old as the sediment suggested. Maybe they weren't human. Maybe erosion or weather had shaped them. Anything to preserve the timeline. Because accepting the prints meant accepting that upright walking, arguably one of the defining traits of our species, had emerged far earlier than taught. But denial eroded beneath the weight of evidence. The dating held, the prints held, the implications held. The ash told a story no one expected, that human ancestors walked like us more than 1 million years before we thought they could. that the path of evolution was not a clean staircase but a tangled web, with features appearing, disappearing, or developing independently in different branches of our ancestral tree. It wasn't just a challenge to dates, it was a challenge to confidence. For generations, students had been taught that evolutionary traits evolved at specific times. That knowledge was linear and complete. But these footprints reminded us that fossils tell only part of the story. The rest is filled in by interpretation, by assumption. The Laetoli footprints were not merely physical evidence. They were philosophical reminders that we often mistake coherence for truth, that what fits into tidy charts may crumble under a single trail of footprints in ancient ash. And that certainty, once cracked, requires more than evidence to repair. It demands humility. So we are left walking with them, those early humans or human-like beings whose feet left quiet echoes we still try to interpret. And we are left asking, how many truths are buried beneath our confidence, waiting for the wind to uncover them one grain at a time? It was a forest no one expected to find. In 1994, deep within the sandstone cliffs of Australia's Wollemi National Park, a park ranger hiking through a remote canyon stumbled upon a grove of strange trees. Towering, dark green, and fern-like, they didn't match any known local species. He clipped a small branch, unaware that he was holding something believed to have vanished from the earth 2 million years ago. It was the Wollemi pine. Botanists were stunned. Every fossil record, every botany textbook, every extinction list declared this tree long gone. It was a well-known species in paleobotany circles, its fossilized remains used as teaching tools in universities. Students learned of its extinction as a matter of fact, an example of how climate change and environmental pressures could eliminate entire species. But the living trees told a different story. Not similar. Not descendants. Identical. Genetic testing confirmed it. These were not relatives of the ancient Wollemi pine. They were the same species. Somehow, in one hidden canyon, they had endured. While the world changed and species rose and fell, these trees had stood quietly, unchanged. Their survival contradicted everything taught about extinction. If a species could vanish from sight for 2 million years and still exist, how could we speak so confidently of what was gone? How many other species, declared extinct, were simply hiding, deep in canyons, on isolated islands, or in unsearched corners of Earth? This was not a remote jungle in an uncharted land. It was a national park, visited by hikers and researchers. The trees had survived unnoticed in plain sight. It forced a rethinking of extinction itself. In science education, extinction is treated as binary. A species is either alive or extinct. This simplicity is useful in the classroom, but dangerously misleading in the wild. The Wollemi pine exposed a flaw in that model, a reminder that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And it humbled the idea that our knowledge of nature is complete. Botany courses had to be revised. The tree once used as a symbol of extinction was now a symbol of survival. It stood as a quiet rebuke to the assumption that the past is fully mapped. The Wollemi pine didn't just rewrite a chapter in botany, it rewrote the tone. It reminded us that life endures in unexpected ways, that nature keeps its secrets well, and that our desire for clean narratives often outpaces the messy reality of biology. So we are left with a question that rustles quietly through the needles of that hidden grove. What else is out there, living in the margins of our maps, reminding us that the world is more alive and more mysterious than we have dared to imagine? It waited beneath the waves. In 2000, off the western coast of India, marine archaeologists scanning the seabed made an astonishing discovery. Beneath 120 feet of water lay what appeared to be the remnants of a vast stone city. Walls, roadways, geometric layouts, structures unmistakably shaped by human hands. And then came the shock. Artifacts recovered from the site. Tools, pottery, organic material were carbon dated to approximately 9,500 years ago. That date changed everything. According to every history textbook, civilization began around 5,000 years ago. Sumer, Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley. These were the cradles of urban life. Before that, humans were thought to be simple hunter-gatherers, living in scattered bands with little social organization or architectural ability. But this underwater site told a different story. Stone architecture on a massive scale. Carefully planned layouts, evidence of engineering, art, and sustained human activity, all thousands of years before such things were supposed to exist. And it lay underwater, suggesting it had once been coastal, later swallowed by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. The implications were staggering. If this city existed 9,500 years ago, it would mean civilization began not in the Fertile Crescent, but potentially thousands of years earlier, and was already advanced enough to build structures in stone. The story of human development would need to be rethought entirely. Initial reaction from mainstream archaeology was swift and dismissive. The structures were natural rock formations, some said. The dating must be wrong. The idea of an ancient advanced city was simply unacceptable. It didn't fit the accepted model. But independent analyses confirmed it. The patterns were geometric, the features consistent with human design. Tool marks were visible. Carbon dating was consistent. The site was not natural. It was human. Still, the textbooks remained unchanged. History, as taught in schools, preferred the older narrative. Civilization began around 3000 BCE. Anything earlier was prehistory, primitive, simple, forgotten. But the underwater city refused to stay forgotten. It asked uncomfortable questions. If one ancient city lies beneath the sea, how many others do too? How much of our past has been drowned, erased not by war or time, but by water? And if civilization began earlier than we thought, what else have we misunderstood? The ocean is Earth's greatest archive. It holds the memory of an earlier world, one we have only begun to uncover. This submerged city does more than challenge a timeline. It challenges a worldview. That human progress is linear, that we know where it began, that the known story is the only story. But beneath the surface, another version waits, silent, sunlit, and older than we dared believe. So we must ask, if the foundations of civilization lie underwater, what else have we built upon sands we thought were stone? The bones told a story no one expected to hear. In 2013, high in the Andes of Peru, archaeologists excavating a 30,000-year-old burial site unearthed human skulls. At first, they seemed like typical relics of a distant past. But then, someone noticed something impossible. Each skull bore a precise circular hole and signs that the bone had healed afterward. These weren't battle wounds. They were surgical. Known as trepanation, the procedure involved drilling or scraping into the skull to relieve pressure, treat injury, or possibly for ritualistic reasons. But what startled researchers was not the act itself. It was the outcome. Over 80% of the skulls showed clear evidence of survival. The patients had lived through the procedure, sometimes more than once. That survival rate was higher than those recorded in the American Civil War. Nearly 3,000 years later, medicine, as it is taught, follows a predictable arc. Ancient practices were crude and superstitious. Progress was slow, halting, and only became truly scientific in the modern era. This narrative casts early healers as well-meaning, but ignorant, fumbling in the dark. But the Peruvian skulls suggested otherwise. These surgeries were clean. The bone was cut precisely, avoiding key blood vessels and sensitive brain areas. There was minimal splintering. Signs of infection were rare. Tools left fine marks, suggesting advanced control. The surgeons clearly knew what they were doing, long before germ theory, long before anesthesia, long before antiseptics. This discovery flipped the assumed timeline of medical advancement. It revealed that some ancient cultures had developed surgical techniques and anatomical knowledge that rivaled, or even exceeded, those of much later civilizations. Medical historians were stunned. How did they control infection without knowing bacteria existed? How did they sedate or calm patients during such invasive operations? What knowledge had these people possessed, and how had it vanished? The answers remain elusive. Some theorize the use of natural antiseptics, herbs with antimicrobial properties passed down through generations. Others suggest a deep observational knowledge of anatomy refined through trial and error over centuries. What is clear is that these procedures were not isolated incidents. They were part of a tradition, a science in its own right. But it was a science lost. Modern students of medicine rarely hear of these skulls. They are not central to curricula. Ancient medicine remains a side note, often dismissed as folklore. And yet here, in the highlands of Peru, is evidence of a sophisticated medical practice that thrived long before modern hospitals existed. The implications ripple outward. What if knowledge isn't always cumulative? What if it peaks, fades, and must be found again? What if some of what we call modern breakthroughs are actually rediscoveries? The skulls, silent and broken, still speak. They tell of a people who studied, experimented, succeeded, who understood healing not through microscopes, but through memory, tradition, and observation, who saved lives using stone tools and intuition. They remind us that intelligence is not bound to time, that sophistication does not require steel or electricity, and they leave us with a simple, sobering question. How much wisdom have we lost because we assumed the past had none to offer? They weren't supposed to be able to build anything. In 2007, on a dry, windswept hilltop in southeastern Turkey, archaeologists unearthed something that defied everything taught about the dawn of human civilization. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles. Some stood over 15 feet tall and weighed more than 20 tons. Carvings of animals covered the surfaces. Foxes, snakes, wild boars, etched with precision and care. This was Gobekli Tepe, and it was old, very old. Radiocarbon dating placed its construction at approximately 11,500 years ago. Thousands of years before the advent of agriculture, before permanent settlements, before cities, before civilization as we understand it. Textbooks had taught that humans developed agriculture first, that stable food supplies led to villages, then cities, then temples. That architecture and social organization were results of farming, not precursors to it. Gobekli Tepe shattered that model. The site was a temple complex, designed, quarried, and constructed by hunter-gatherers. There were no signs of permanent residence, no domesticated grains, no herded animals. And yet, someone had organized people to carve, transport, and raise massive stones with symbolic art. The level of planning and labor required was staggering. It required engineering, coordination, and a shared cultural or spiritual vision. It wasn't the work of a few scattered nomads, it was the work of a structured, intentional community. And it came long before anyone believed humans could organize on such a scale. The discovery didn't just push back the timeline of civilization, it reversed it. If hunter-gatherers built temples before agriculture, then perhaps spirituality, ritual, and community preceded farming, not the other way around. Perhaps it was the desire to gather, to worship, to build together that led humans to domesticate plants and animals, not simply the pursuit of food security. The academic world reacted with skepticism. Some scholars insisted the dating must be wrong. Others argued the site had been misinterpreted. But excavation after excavation confirmed its age, its complexity, its meaning. Gobekli Tepe did not fit into the neat model of progress we had built. It exposed a deep flaw in our understanding of human development, the assumption that culture follows agriculture, that spiritual or symbolic thinking only comes after basic survival needs are met, that humans only build once they settle. But here were people who built before they farmed, people who carved meaning into stone before they ground grain into flour, people who gathered not for harvest, but for mystery. The implications are profound. What if the roots of civilization lie not in economics, but in imagination, in shared stories, in a desire to reach beyond the visible and carve symbols into permanence? Gobekli Tepe still stands, buried for thousands of years, now unearthed as a quiet contradiction. It challenges not just the timeline of history, but the story we tell about ourselves. And it leaves us wondering, what if our need to build was never just about survival, but about remembering something sacred, something we never wanted to forget? It began with a map that shouldn't exist. In 1992, researchers examining a collection of medieval maps came across something puzzling. Among them was the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. It showed familiar coastlines, Europe, Africa, parts of the Americas. But then came the anomaly. Antarctica. Not only was the continent included centuries before its official discovery in 1820, but it was drawn without its ice sheet, showing bays, inlets, and a coastal outline that matched what modern science only uncovered using ground-penetrating radar in the 20th century. That should have been impossible. Medieval cartographers weren't supposed to have such knowledge. The projection techniques, the global positioning, the coastal accuracy, all contradicted what historians taught about the state of mapping and navigation in the 16th century. And yet, the lines were there, precise, measurable, real. Most shocking was the portrayal of Antarctica's subglacial coastline, features buried under thousands of feet of ice, invisible for millennia. How could a 500-year-old map depict a landscape not seen by human eyes for over 6,000 years? There was only one plausible conclusion. The map was based on far older sources. Maps that originated before the ice, or at least before Antarctica, was fully frozen, which meant someone, long before recorded history, had mapped parts of the world with a level of detail and accuracy that modern civilization only rediscovered in the last century. Historians reacted with caution, then dismissal. Coincidence, they said. The resemblance to Antarctica was accidental, the map's accuracy overstated. But cartographic analysis told a different story. The map used spherical projection techniques not believed to exist until the Renaissance. The placement of land masses aligned with surprising precision. It suggested an unsettling possibility, that ancient civilizations possessed advanced geographic and navigational knowledge that was lost, forgotten, and later assumed to have never existed. This was not an isolated case. Other old maps, some from the Middle Ages, others even older, contained anomalies. Islands that later vanished, continents drawn with unexplained detail, all of them hinting at forgotten sources. If true, the implications are vast. It would mean human civilization has reached high levels of knowledge before, then fallen back. That mapping the globe wasn't a singular achievement of the modern era, but a rediscovery of skills once known and then lost to time. This challenges the comforting story of linear progress, that humans slowly and steadily became smarter, more capable, more advanced. It suggests peaks and valleys, knowledge gained and then forgotten. A history of remembering, erasing, and relearning. The Piri Reis map and others like it remain deeply controversial, but their presence forces a reckoning, not with conspiracy, but with complexity. They remind us that what we call ancient ignorance may be modern amnesia, that what seems improbable is sometimes simply inconvenient. And they leave us with an enduring question. If someone mapped the world long before we believe it was possible, what else did they know that we have yet to rediscover? It looked like an ordinary clay jar. In 1936, during an archaeological dig near Baghdad, a group of workers unearthed a collection of simple ceramic vessels. Each contained a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and traces of acidic residue. At first, they seemed like basic storage containers, until someone noticed the unusual design. One researcher had a theory. He built a replica, filled it with vinegar, and connected it to a voltmeter. It produced electricity. This artifact, eventually dubbed the Baghdad battery, was a functional galvanic cell, a device capable of generating electrical current, and it was over 2,000 years old. This shouldn't have been possible. According to modern teaching, electricity wasn't discovered until the 18th century. Theoretical understanding came with scientists like Franklin and Volta. Practical applications, light bulbs, motors, circuits, didn't appear until the industrial age. Electricity was a symbol of modernity. Yet here it was, humming quietly in antiquity. The implications were explosive. If ancient civilizations had not only discovered electricity, but built devices to harness it, what else had they achieved? What had we overlooked or dismissed? Skeptics pushed back quickly. The jars were too crude, they said. The resemblance to modern batteries must be accidental. Perhaps the vessels were used for storing scrolls or sacred oils. But replication experiments consistently produced electrical current. And there was more. Metal artifacts from the same region and era showed signs of electroplating, an industrial technique that uses electrical current to deposit one metal onto another. Ancient texts spoke of lights that burned without flame in temples. Could these batteries have powered such lights? Or were they used for medicine, rituals, or metallurgy? We may never know exactly how they were used. But the design was deliberate, the construction repeatable, the results undeniable. The discovery shattered the narrative of linear technological progress. We like to believe that knowledge flows in one direction, from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. But the Baghdad battery suggested otherwise, that perhaps some technologies are discovered, lost, and rediscovered again centuries later. It exposed a blind spot in how history is taught. Students are shown a timeline: fire, wheel, plow, steam, electricity, internet. But real history is jagged, full of forgotten brilliance and collapsed genius. Civilizations rise, innovate, vanish, and with them, their discoveries. The battery forces us to reconsider what we think ancient people knew. They weren't just builders of temples and monuments. They were observers, tinkerers, experimenters, capable of abstract thought and technical achievement. The very act of building a battery requires understanding of chemistry, materials, and electrical principles, however intuitive or practical that knowledge may have been. It challenges our arrogance. Modern society often assumes it is the pinnacle of knowledge. But perhaps we are not the first to harness the unseen forces of nature. Perhaps we are only the latest. And it asks a quiet, persistent question. What if history is not a ladder we climb, but a spiral we keep returning to, each time believing we are the first to arrive? It came from the sea, corroded and silent. In 1900, sponge divers off the coast of the Greek island Antikythera discovered a sunken Roman shipwreck. Among the amphorae and bronze statues was a strange lump of metal and wood. It was brought to the surface, catalogued, and mostly ignored, until decades later when X-rays revealed something astonishing within. Gears. Dozens of them. Interlocking. Precise. This was no simple device. It was a machine. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be known, was a complex analog computer built over 2,000 years ago. Its gears calculated the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. It could predict eclipses, track lunar phases, and even forecast the timing of Olympic Games. According to the textbooks, such mechanical sophistication did not exist in the ancient world. Gear trains that intricate were thought to be a product of the Renaissance, emerging more than 1,000 years after the ship that carried this device sank. And yet the gears turned. Crafted with teeth so fine they required advanced tools and mathematical understanding, the mechanism revealed a depth of scientific knowledge previously unimagined for the ancient Greeks. The implications were profound. This wasn't just an artifact, it was a statement, a challenge to the narrative that technological progress is linear and cumulative, that early civilizations were limited by their ignorance, that mechanical computation began in the age of clocks and telescopes. Here was proof that ancient minds had already reached those heights, and then lost them. The mechanism was so advanced that some modern engineers struggled to recreate it using only the tools available in its time. Its gear ratios reflected astronomical cycles with mathematical accuracy. It showed that its creators not only understood celestial motion, but could model it mechanically. How many such devices once existed? How much of that knowledge vanished? Historians had few answers. It was likely built in Rhodes or Alexandria, possibly influenced by the teachings of Archimedes. But after the fall of Rome and the decline of ancient science, the technology disappeared. It left no lineage, no manuals, no successors. By the time Europeans began building clocks a millennium later, the trail had gone cold. The Antikythera mechanism had been swallowed by the sea and by forgetfulness. Its rediscovery raises troubling questions. If such knowledge was once attained, why did it vanish? How fragile is human understanding if a single war, fire, or fall can erase centuries of progress? We teach that history advances, that technology builds upon itself, that once discovered, knowledge is secure. But the corroded gears say otherwise. They remind us that knowledge is vulnerable, that even brilliance can be buried, that a single artifact, if lost, can rewrite what we believe about an entire civilization. And they ask us to reconsider a deeper assumption. Are we truly more advanced than those who came before, or just lucky that more of our knowledge has survived the sea? It wasn't just one anomaly, it was a pattern. As each discovery unfolded, a sailor frozen in time, a fish thought extinct, a temple older than agriculture, a troubling realization emerged. These weren't isolated errors or footnotes in history. They formed a constellation of contradiction, each one challenging something taught as fact. By themselves, any one of these findings might be dismissed. An outlier, a misinterpretation, a curious exception. But together they tell a larger story, that what we call knowledge is often a snapshot, taken with limited light, limited tools, and a desire for clarity that sometimes blurs the truth. From the Lotoli footprints that rewrote human evolution to the Baghdad battery that questioned the timeline of electrical technology, each case forced experts to do something uncomfortable, admit that certainty had outrun evidence. It wasn't just about being wrong. It was about how confidently the wrongness had been taught. In classrooms, students memorized dates, facts, and milestones. Civilization began here. Medicine became science then. These inventions happened in this century. These species went extinct at that time. But reality is messier. History doesn't unfold in a straight line. It loops, forgets, and rediscovers. Ancient people didn't lack intelligence or creativity. They had different knowledge, some of which may have surpassed our own in ways we don't yet recognize. And yet, the institutional reflex is to resist. When faced with discoveries that don't fit the model, The first reaction is often denial. The evidence must be flawed. The dating must be wrong. Anything to preserve the coherence of what's already believed. But science and history must be braver than that. To learn is to revise, and to explore is to admit that the map may be incomplete. True scholarship doesn't fear contradiction, it embraces it as the engine of growth. What binds these 10 discoveries together is not conspiracy or mystery. It's the human tendency to simplify what we teach, and the human resilience that refuses to stay inside those boundaries. The sailor's survival teaches us about the body's will. The coelacanth reminds us that life hides. The Peruvian surgeons show us that genius is not bound to era. The Antikythera mechanism proves that brilliance can be lost and found again. And across them all runs a deeper thread. That wonder lies not in what we already know, but in what we've yet to understand. These contradictions don't weaken knowledge, they deepen it. They remind us to question, to stay curious, to look again. And they ask, what other forgotten truths lie buried beneath the surface of what we call fact? What other chapters remain unwritten in the long, unfinished story of human understanding? Some stories are lost, others are simply ignored. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, educators and experts have sought to build a coherent narrative, something teachable, examinable, defensible. And that's understandable. Systems need structure. But in creating that structure, we've sometimes mistaken stability for accuracy. What the frozen sailor, the coelacanth, the Laetoli footprints, and Gobekli Tepe share is not just their defiance of established knowledge, but the silence that followed their discovery. In most classrooms, they are rarely mentioned. If they are, it is briefly, cautiously, framed as anomalies rather than opportunities to reconsider larger truths. The impulse to protect the integrity of the timeline outweighs the invitation to question it. But the silence carries a cost. When students are taught a sanitized version of history, they inherit not just knowledge, but limits. They learn that innovation follows a script, that progress is linear, that ancient people were less intelligent, that science and history are tidy, uncontested, and complete. And so the contradiction becomes not just historical, but educational. We do not teach these discoveries because they do not fit. And because they do not fit, we teach a version of the past that is less than whole, less alive, less human. But what if we taught uncertainty as part of the curriculum? What if we taught history as an evolving dialogue between evidence and interpretation rather than a fixed list of facts? What if students learned not just the answers, but how those answers came to be, and how they might change again? To do so would be to honor the very spirit of inquiry that makes science and history noble, not the possession of truth, but the pursuit of it. These discoveries offer something greater than controversy. They offer a richer understanding of the human story, one in which intelligence is not confined to modernity, in which survival is an act of will as much as biology, in which the earth still holds secrets. And we are not yet finished listening. In an age of information overload, it's tempting to crave certainty, but certainty can become a cage, and the past is too vast, too strange, too beautiful to be locked in one version. Instead, we must return to what makes us human: curiosity, the courage to ask again, to look deeper, to change our minds. We owe it to the children memorizing timelines. We owe it to the nameless builders, sailors, and thinkers whose lives left traces beyond our comprehension. And we owe it to ourselves, to resist the comfort of settled knowledge in favor of a deeper, wilder, more wondrous truth. Because perhaps the real measure of a civilization isn't how much it knows, but how willing it is to learn again, even from its own forgotten past. In the end, it's not about the artifacts, not the skulls, or maps, or frozen remains, not the footprints pressed into ash, or the gears sealed in ancient bronze. It's about something quieter, something harder to name, the distance between what we think we know and what remains to be discovered. Each of the 10 cases we explored began the same way, with a find, a thing that didn't belong, a pattern that didn't fit, a timeline that cracked open. But where they led was not into mystery for mystery's sake. It was into a confrontation with our own assumptions, with the way we arrange the past into a story that comforts us, confirms us, and assures us of our place in the world. These discoveries challenge that, not to unseat reason, but to remind us that reason must remain open. If the Antikythera mechanism could vanish from memory for 2,000 years, what else has been lost? If a temple predates agriculture, what does that say about our understanding of culture? If humans could survive the Arctic for years longer than survival guides permit, what limits are we still underestimating? And if a tree can live unseen for 2 million years, what else waits quietly, just beyond the edge of what we look for? This story isn't about rewriting all of history. It's about releasing it from the illusion of finality. It's about seeing knowledge not as a fortress, but as a bridge, a way to span time, connect lives, and carry meaning forward. It's about understanding that truth is not brittle. It does not break when questioned. It strengthens. So as we close this journey, we return to a simple idea, that history is alive, not just in textbooks or monuments, but in the soil, the sea, the bones, the blood. It breathes through contradiction, through what was missed or buried, through what was deemed irrelevant until it wasn't. We stand on the shoulders of forgotten geniuses. We repeat what was once understood. We marvel at rediscoveries. And we too will be misunderstood someday. Perhaps the future will look back at us and wonder what we overlooked, what quiet truths we passed by, what limits we believed were unbreakable. And so we leave you with a final question, not to answer, but to carry. What else have we taught as fact that was really just the first draft of a deeper story still unfolding?